killer wants to go to college. He wants to get his...
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark DiCarlo. Tonight, my guest is Mr. Douglas Mann,
Hello.
Assistant District Attorney. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
So you're also running for judge, correct?
That is correct.
Which judicial seat are you running?
I'll be the
for?
Republican candidate for the 28th District Court in November.
Who is currently Judge Nanette Hassett, correct?
That is correct.
I hate to ask such a trite question, but I will. Why are you running for judge? Is it because you make a lot more money than assistant DA? Is that why?
Not really.
I mean, that would be a motive for me, but I don't know. Maybe I'm greedy. Go ahead.
I have one of the greatest jobs in the world, and I love trial work. The thing about it is I had been a supervisor for that court and noticed that it had problems. I've had people ask me, when did you first consider running for that spot? And I tell them the thought crossed my mind in the hallway outside an afternoon of revocation hearings. I was waiting to talk to the prosecutors I was supervising, but the defendants came out in what they called the chain. They had all been up for revocations of probation, and they were laughing and congratulating each other on how their silly stories fooled the judge and no one was getting revoked that day.
Well, on the motion, well, first of all, what's a chain?
The chain is a group of prisoners going back from the court in handcuffs to jail. Even if they've been ordered released, they have to book out.
Well, these people who were congratulating themselves on fooling themselves don't really know that they fooled the judge.
Oh,
They don't really know. I mean, how would you know? Because a lot of times the judges don't indicate whether or not what the basis for their reasoning was. Correct?
It just struck me that it was engendering disrespect to our legal system, that these people were in all likelihood going to be back because the message being sent was, if you have a good story, you can pretty much do what you want or not do the conditions of probation.
Isn't there, I will say this as a person who has done criminal defense law ever since I've been practicing, we have a discussion, I guess, amongst criminal defense lawyers. I guess we kind of like somebody who has done criminal defense work because they know what's going on. They know that some of these clients, some of these criminal defendants are less criminals and more troubled with drug problems, alcohol problems, and doing things more to hurt themselves than they are anyone else. So I guess amongst the criminal defense bar, we like to see people who have done criminal defense work. I think you've done some, is that right?
That's true. I was self-employed, doing general practice, including criminal defense from 1997 to I did return to civil work a couple of times with other firms. I was a partner in Peeler, Cartwright, and Mann. But I always kept some criminal cases in those firms so I could keep my hand in. And those meant defending people charged with crime. And you are right. A large number of people who come through the system, we need to try to rehabilitate. 7% of the population, however, commits 77% of the crime. So think about that ratio. There's a small number of people that you are not going to rehabilitate, and they're simply laughing at the system when you attempt to try to.
Well, the other side of that argument, of course, is that's an interesting statistic, by the way. 7% commit 77% of the crime, if true, if a valid statistic.
Yes.
But the other side of the argument is of course, you've heard the statistic that the United States has the largest percentage of prisoners in the world. That in fact, that it has created a prison population wherein crime is encouraged. It's become a school for crime, and it's created a subculture for criminal groups, including the prison gang. There's some indication regarding that too, correct?
Yes, but I think there's a certain mythology that goes with that. First offenders do not get commingled with hardened criminals. While clerking for the Court of Criminal Appeals, a group of us took a tour of the TDCJ system. The first unit we visited was male first offenders. They were well behaved. It was an orderly administration. They stayed behind the lines they were supposed to be stayed behind, and there were no outbursts of any kind. Then we went to a women's unit, and it was crazy. I would much have preferred to spend my time as a guard or employee within the system at the first offender unit than guarding the women inmates who had been there before.
Well, let's go to your visit to TDCJ. For example, we often hear, and I have experience with my guys who've gotten out of prison and talked to me, and I try to sometimes survey, see what's going on. There's you've represented people accused of sexual assault, aggravated sexual assault of a minor. You've prosecuted them and defended them, I would assume.
I actually have not defended child cases.
Well, let me tell you this: it doesn't. The community doesn't endear itself to you when you do that. But
I understand, and it's a necessary factor. I think Doug Tinker, one of our late great defense attorneys, used to tell civic groups that we were necessary to the system just as much as the state or the judge, because until that man or woman got a fair trial, he was not ready to go to prison yet. That's part of our system. We can't just send people off, no matter how hateful we think the crime may be or how deserving they are of our displeasure. They have a right to a fair trial.
Well, and then the myth has been that a lot of times young men especially who had been in fact, and it's not a myth, it has factually occurred, were often victimized by sexual assaults themselves, forced sodomy, etc., in prison. Okay. Have you found that to be true in the Texas Department of, I think they still believe they call it Texas Department of Corrections and or Texas Department of Criminal Justice, whatever
the new name is the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Institutional Division. And once again,
I can't keep up with the Big Brother's name.
It's the same group we used to call TDC back when it was the Texas Department of Corrections. It's simply a name change.
Maybe it's because in some of my trials, I don't have an inflated ego, but I'm just half joking. Maybe it's because I told the juries, I said, you know, the name of the institution you have to send these my client to is the Texas Department of Corrections. That implies that they're trying to correct his behavior and not punish him. At least that was an argument I used to throw out there.
It's a valid one, but there are actually 5 purposes recognized in criminology for our criminal justice system, only one of which is rehabilitation. Another one is deterrence. I frequently use that argument as a prosecutor, that we do want to deter people in the community watching the results of a trial from thinking, you know, if I commit that if I commit that offense, nothing really bad is going to happen.
And there's 2 purposes from an old penology course. Deterrence of that person, and then deterrence of the community at law, right?
Correct. Sometimes called general and special deterrence. That's
then
right.
There's rehabilitation, right?
That's correct.
Rehabilitation. And then there's punishment.
That's correct.
And then I've forgotten.
One of them is actually retribution.
Retribution.
We want a grieving family of a murder victim to know that the state's going to handle this problem. Don't take it into your own hands. So justice will be part of our system, but if you attempt to take justice into your own hands, you will be charged as well.
But retribution is not mentioned in the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, the Texas Penal Code, is it?
It's actually not. It's a criminology term.
So there you go.
Yes.
Just teasing. So I would just returning to that subject matter regarding whether or not there is forced sexual assault in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice system of sexual offenders. Have you seen that to be the case?
I can't really answer that question because it's been so long since I toured the system. They do have a system of segregation that prevents general population from encompassing people like first offenders, sexual offenders, officers who've committed crimes who would be at risk to murder.
I'm going to give a compliment to the system. I've asked sexual offenders before who've been to prison for that crime. I have never known anybody that was sexually assaulted as a result of committing sexual assault against a minor. I have never heard of it occurring. So I'm kind of proud of the system for that. I think that's a great thing. They do say that there's a lot of psychological intimidation, hatred for them in the system. Even though they're often segregated, maybe there'd be name calling, etc. So at least the system is working in that regards, I would think. So we're talking about prison gangs. So you're a gang prosecutor now, is that right?
That's correct. We're doing
so
that.
like, what's a gang?
Under
what a gang is.
Under the penal code, a gang is 3 or more people with an identifiable symbol or color engaging in criminal activity. It's fairly general.
Okay, so when you're really talking about gang prosecution in Nueces County, realistically, aren't you talking about primarily young Mexican Americans who are joining in various gangs? That's the common gang in Corpus Christi, Texas, correct?
I don't know if you can generalize it quite that way. And essentially, we have different groups that we're talking about. Your first reference is correct. We have a problem with prison gangs. Prison gangs, by definition, recruit people who are sent to prison or some other adjunct of the correctional system. We actually have heard of prison gangs recruiting at the drug treatment facilities. Then we have street gangs, and I think that's the generalization that you've used here. We have people on the streets. Frequently, they're not supervised. Maybe they only have one parent. She has to work. They get involved with this group. It's a family substitute. And yet, the purpose of this group is not to support young people growing up. It's to commit crimes. It's to be the baddest.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
To be the baddest guy on the block and to get what you want as opposed to what the other guy wants. And last but not least,
is it real? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Last one would be taggers. Within the gang prosecution system, tagging crews, as we call them, are considered a part of the gang docket for a number of reasons. Number one, they do frequently overlap with the same street gangs we're talking about. There are instances of violent behavior and drug sales with people who would otherwise be generalized as simply being graffiti artists. And because of the overlap, it's a decision of Mr. Skirka and his predecessors that all of these groups would be encompassed within the gang prosecution unit.
All right, when you talk about a street gang, does the street gang have a name?
Yes, many of them have a
give us maybe
particular
3 or 4 names of street gangs in Corpus Christi, Texas.
I think probably the one most people are going to be relatively familiar with from the last year is going to be La Cuarenta, because there was a prominent anti-gang injunction issued against certain members of that gang. La Cuarenta is only one of many. There are...
I just asked for maybe 2 or 3 names.
Sure.
What's La Cuarenta mean?
I believe it's
quarter?
the quarter or the 40. Yeah, there are a group of streets over on the west side of town. It's a general geographic area that made it easy to fit within the anti-gang prescription because it usually refers to a particular area that has problems with the gang. In that instance, it was very demonstrable, to the court. Okay, this is the area of town that we're talking about, where gang conduct should be enjoined and was enjoined by these individuals. That's their turf, if you will, that particular part of town.
Well, how many members are there in that gang?
It's difficult to say. We have criteria that the CCPD must follow in naming someone as a known gang member. It's not just we think, we suspect, we're going to call this guy a gang member. They can be listed as suspected if they meet lower level criteria, but unless they self-admit, they say, yes, I'm a member of this gang, or we meet, I believe it's 3 of the other criteria, that person can only be listed as suspected and not known. Once the person admits to officers, usually on the gang unit, that they're a member of the gang, that is a significant enough identifier to place that person as a known gang member at that point.
The gang members often, though, put a tattoo on their body somewhere and announce that they're a gang member, right?
That's frequently the case. There are certain identifiable features with different gangs. One that also comes to mind from not too long back is we've had some violent crime outbreaks involving a gang called the Suicidal Barrios. Frequently they'll have the initials SB, or they'll translate the initials to the number of the alphabet to try to disguise it somewhat from law enforcement. So it's not at all unusual to see, for example, the prison gang Mexican Mafia using 13, M being the 13th letter of the alphabet.
And we hear this Mexican Mafia a lot. Oh, he is a member of the Mexican Mafia. Is there a gang called the Mexican Mafia in Corpus Christi?
Right. They actually call themselves Mexicanami, and there is a book that was written by one of the initial law enforcement officers to document their existence in the area around Los Angeles. It talks about the development of that group there and how they recruited throughout the prison system. Most of our prison gangs actually started within the California prison system. For example, Texas Syndicate, despite the name of our state and their title, the founding members were all incarcerated in the California system and quickly moved their group to Texas.
And of course, I don't know that this was the cause, but California is famous for the first experimentation, I think, in lengthy prison sentences with the 3 strikes and you're outlaw. Is that right?
I believe they were one of the leading states at that time.
Okay. So there is an argument to be made, whether it be correct or incorrect, that that might have been a case wherein that was maybe unsuccessful. Lengthier prison sentences were unsuccessful.
You could also criticize perhaps the failure to segregate inmates at the time this first became a problem. In the Texas system now, there's a system that they call administrative segregation to ensure that members of the Texas syndicate aren't exposed to members of other rival gangs that would lead to violence, and also to prevent them, hopefully, from recruiting within the general population. As a result, however, many of these gangs now encourage new members not to get the identifying tattoos. That enables them to fly under the radar and still do business within the general population.
Well, I mean, obviously, that's just a wise, that'd be a wise thing, right? I mean,
Sure.
I have asked many times my clients if they have a tattoo which might be interpreted as one that would identify them as a gang member. And let me tell you, when they do, I feel a sinking feeling in my stomach. And I would say this too, many clients, I'm afraid that once they're labeled as a member of a gang, it hurts them. I think that they're treated differently when they go to prison. And I think a lot of times, somehow, the way they work it, I don't know all the things about parole and all this, somehow they wind up serving longer time in prison.
I don't know about that.
I think so. The way they mark you, they put that down there, and then once let's say that you go back to prison and you're a Mexican mafia member. And then if you go back, even though in fact you could have withdrawn from the Mexican mafia, which we don't know, I mean, it could be true, you're still labeled there and, with a commensurate, whatever that marking on your TDC record means.
And they have a complete system within the prison system for documenting that. We had the ability to get their database, but actually don't because of the security is fairly strenuous. If I have an inquiry for them, I usually communicate with a member of the TDCJ staff designed to what they call the security threat groups. They look at prison gangs as a security threat group, or STG. And I can usually ask, based upon this offender's name and date of birth, do you show him as confirmed within your system? Because frequently they will relocate to avoid the stigma of the local officers who know them to be involved in gang activity. They'll parole to a different city and then hook up with someone else.
I see. Like what city? Like in Corpus Christi, they might parole to San Antonio or something?
San Antonio, there's a lot of overlap with the Valley.
But isn't that like a good thing? I've often thought that, and I can't prove this to be the case in any way, shape, manner, or form, just talking generally, that what's the use of getting these guys out of prison and putting back in the same social class group, the same geographical area, with the same people they knew? I mean, obviously that would increase their chances of returning to crime, right?
Sure, and we can't prevent them from paroling to a different location. Hopefully it does work out that way. Unfortunately, there always will be people who have recruited into these prison gangs who will follow the directions they receive by the gang and within 30 days of their parole find a representative within that city to report to. So it's still a conscious decision by the offender. Do they want to change? Do they want to get away from that? Or do they want to get back into that lifestyle?
But and some of this is off point. I just curious, kind of conversation since we're talking about the subject matter. Most of the gang workers aren't working, most of the gang members, they're not working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, are they?
Probably not, yeah.
Okay. And most of them maybe aren't married with kids, right?
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So you think there is a correlation between maybe not work and not a correlation necessarily between single or family life. But there's probably other correlations too as well. Obviously, if they don't have a drug, how many of our gang members have drug or alcohol problems? Probably a substantial amount.
It's part of the lifestyle. Goes with the territory. Yeah.
And what are most of the crimes, since you're a gang prosecutor, correct? And you've
Yes.
been the gang prosecutor in Oasis County for how long?
Since I came back in 2005, I was promoted to supervisor for a couple of years, but asked to be returned to the gang spot because I find it rewarding. So I've been back since 2009 to today. And all those times around the supervisor position, I've been prosecuting gang cases.
All right, so what is the average gang case that you're prosecuting? Is it a drug? It's a drug case, isn't it? Drug or theft?
We have burglary, Drugs. Monday I should be going to trial on a possession with intent to deliver involving a drug house that was raided and made the news. A lot of these larger cases were firearms, drugs, large amounts of money, evidence of drug sales. Those are going to be connected to gangs who are the suppliers or promoters of that activity. That doesn't also mean they're not violent conduct. We have two prison gangs right now that just don't seem to want to get along together, whether it's over turf, the drug sales, or whatever. Many of the violent crimes that occur on our streets are one gang member shooting another or shooting at another. And of course, that bullet's going to keep going. It's not going to recognize.
And that's the problem, of course.
It is.
Always, perhaps somebody who's innocent getting hurt.
It is.
More than the other gang member who's looking for trouble getting hurt, right?
Just 2 years ago, we had a man gunned down at a bus stop at Corona and Flynn Parkway. Employees of the building, where some social services offices, as well as insurance businesses were located, said that they thought someone was throwing rocks at the building, and what they were hearing was the misses and shoot-throughs hitting the side of their building. The man's wife and small child were with him at the bus stop when he was gunned down in their presence.
But most of these, let's say this, since you've been back, what is the most amount of drugs that you've ever found by a gang?
Well, typically...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Typically, the federal authorities will take the really big cases. So the U.S. Attorney's Office tends to get more of those than we do. We have right now a 1.98 kilogram case. Not grams, kilograms. So 1,980 grams. And of course, a gram is considered personal use. So that tells you something about the volume. We've had...
Well, how many pounds is that? Because some of us forget. I always have to, when I get one of the, especially the federal case, I got to go to kilograms, then I got to go to this chart, and then,
It's about 25 and a fraction. I want to say it's like 3.6 or something grams per ounce. And if you do the math for ounces, you can figure out that's pounds of controlled substance. We had two men within the last 3 months who pled out to exactly 1 kilogram of heroin that they had picked up here in Corpus Christi, refused to divulge where they were taking it or why, and each of them took 40 years in prison concurrent.
One of the things that I disagree with in our criminal system, the only one I've ever worked in, is, God, how much time did they receive?
40 years.
Okay. So you get 40 years on a non-aggravated case. The Texas Department, again, what are they, criminal justice or whatever, corrections, whatever they're calling it now. All right, so you get 40 years, and you tell your guy, on a 40-year sentence, you'll serve 12 years, whatever it is. Maybe it's probably more, maybe it might be more, 14 or 16. It's always changing, right?
It varies, depending on overcrowding. And
I don't know if you were practicing. I was practicing for a while there for about maybe a 3-year period where you were serving 1 month for every year of your sentence. If it was a 40-year sentence, we'd give you 40 months. Okay. But now it's all very convoluted, because if somebody gets 10 years on an aggravated case because there was let's say it's a child molestation case, so it's aggravated. It's called aggravated. A 10-year sentence might actually be a lengthier sentence in prison than a 40-year sentence.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so, obviously, I think that it caused, there's these, what is the right to due process, right to know I've never brought it up to the courts yet. Every day's a new day.
Yes.
I've never brought it up to the courts yet, but it seems to me that there's some sort of, would that be due process violations or something implied, wherein you don't really know what kind of time you're going to serve. You know what time is in the books. Third degree, third degree, 2 to 10. The second, 2 to 20, 5 to 99. You know what's written in the books, but practically speaking, you oftentimes don't know the actual amount of time that you're going to be serving. Isn't that right?
That's true. The same day that the two men pled out for 40 years without blinking an eye, there was a young offender charged with a lower level of the same offense. I think we had like 10 grams or something in his possession. And he was so upset that he was going to get 12 years in prison, he tried to break out a jury room window in the 214th District Court to throw himself to the pavement below. The bailiff stopped him, but you compare the 12 years to 40 years, he was convinced in his mind that
he was going to be going
he
for
was going to
12 years.
serve 12 years in prison.
And the truth of the matter is, on a 12-year sentence, he might have served 2.5 years, especially first time.
Sure, absolutely.
Because it was non-aggravated, et cetera.
That's right.
And so, so on let's say that you're looking at a case. Let's say that you're looking at a case of a young woman The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
All right.
You're looking at the name of a young woman. She doesn't have an extensive criminal record, except maybe, I don't know, goofball stuff, which I think of as goofball stuff. Possession of marijuana, DWI, general goofiness, you know what I'm saying? Nothing real malevolent to someone else or something. All right, so
Right.
she does goofy, and she's dating a guy. Somehow she goes along with the guy. The guy picks somebody else up. They pick somebody else up. They torture him and/or beat him up. She comes clean. Maybe she comes clean, or maybe she tells you her own involvement. Okay, so something like that. What kind of factors do you look at when you decide what sort of a plea bargain offer, and you are the person responsible for tendering a plea bargain as the assistant district attorney, correct?
Yes, with some limits, of course,
With
by
some limits.
office policy.
Okay, so how do you determine what kind of a plea bargain to make? Maybe a young woman who got involved with some goofy guys because she was high that day, who doesn't have much of a prior criminal record. What do you look at?
Well, of course, the first thing you're going to look at is the nature of the crime. However, if she's guilty under the law of parties, which I think is the scenario you're describing,
Yes,
she
didn't actually torture anybody.
but
didn't
she
actually beat
facilitated
somebody
the,
up.
yeah, she facilitated the people who did, knowing that
Marginally, maybe she drove them there because she had a boyfriend that asked them to, and she did not know maybe the results of what she was doing. Yeah.
Right. Well, under Texas law, of course, we have what's called the law of parties. We don't have accessories or accomplices. If you assist knowing the crime's going to be committed, you can be found guilty of the crime. But everyone, the prosecutors, defense lawyers, jurors, are all going to realize that the culpability for a getaway driver is not the same as the man that walks into the bank with a gun. So we're going to analyze her participation first. Then we'll look at that criminal record. And if you're talking about things like shoplifting, marijuana, especially possession of less than 2 ounces, that's not going to be a big factor in deciding this person can't be rehabilitated. The scenario you've described, she's assisted law enforcement. I'm assuming you meant she gave a truthful, or there'll always be some what we call minimizing. When person first agrees to give information, they're going to minimize their own conduct. But assuming that she hasn't just totally misled the law enforcement officers, if she has led to apprehending the dangerous people that are willing to torture and kill people, she needs to get some credit for that too. And all of this gets factored in to the decision, what's a fair punishment? First thing I try to look at is what is a range that a jury might be likely to do with this? And also, what's the community going to say? If this gets printed up by the media incorrectly and they perceive that she's one of the actors, are they going to say, well, she got a slap on the wrist? But that's not the controlling factor. And ultimately, it's going to be what you might call the going rate, what we think 12
Well, that's
good,
there's a market rate for a
exactly.
case. That's what I tell my
12
clients.
people, good and true, chosen
you know.
from our community. What are they likely to do if they hear this case? And ultimately, that's the way it should work. I mean, we should be guided by the conscience of the community. Periodically, we try cases to see what does our community think about these. We had a case recently. We hadn't tried a graffiti case in a while, and a jury of 12 people heard a young man's case who had done this before. He'd been through the juvenile justice system, but had never been convicted of a felony. And I think his only misdemeanor may have been like you described, marijuana or penalty group 3 drugs like Xanax or something. And yet, they agreed with us that this crime right now in our community is out of control, that it doesn't send a good message to the other people in our community that, oh yeah, you get one free tagging, no matter how much damage you do or whether it's to a church or school or community center, your first one's free. And they agreed. They gave him the minimum sentence, 6 months in state jail. I thought that was fair.
Well, you know, on this graffiti, drawing graffiti or pictures or words on the sides of these buildings, I kind of think that's a very malevolent act because they don't get anything out of it. It's just a malicious kind of act, defacing somebody's,
Right.
You know, if you go buy drugs and you like to take the drugs, which is something maybe immature, very immature and foolish, but people do it, that's hurting you primarily. Or if you go steal something, at least you're getting some money. But when you go doing that, what is the reason these people write graffiti on the sides of property? do they get anything out of it? Because I'm under the impression they don't. It's just pure meanness or something.
Other than the thrill of having violated our laws, of having done this in the community. And of course, in their subculture, there's a certain fame that goes along with putting up your crew and your name in the most prominent parts of town. And that's the only thing I've been able to determine motivates this conduct.
Is much of the graffiti related to the gangs that you were talking about? So do some of the graffiti, this identifies this gang, this identifies that gang?
Sure, absolutely. Some of it is recruiting. And you may see, for a while, particularly over in the area of Cunningham Middle School, two rival gangs were throwing up lots of graffiti. They would actually disrespect the other gang's initials by crossing it out and put their own up because they wanted to get those young children in middle school thinking, well, that's the gang to join. Those guys got it going on. They were almost routinely trying to cross out each other's graffiti and cover it with their own. So that was very really a competition about recruitment. It's died down somewhat since then. Those gangs have been thinned out.
Well, when I drive around Corpus Christi, I haven't noticed that graffiti is as extreme a problem as in some cities I've seen. Is that true? Or I don't know if you could objectively know that, how we compare to other cities in terms of graffiti of similar size.
It is difficult to say without just visiting those cities and seeing their situation. Being a native of Houston, I return to Houston fairly frequently, and then have been some parts of town where you do see a lot of graffiti.
Right.
And in Corpus Christi, it tends to be more cyclical. We'll have these instances where one group's going to outshow the other group, and then a number of them get arrested, and things calm down a little bit for a while.
Let's see here. And then, can you interpret what the graffiti oftentimes means, or sometimes you can't interpret it, what it means? Is there because there's to me, it doesn't make any sense, any of it. Well, when I see graffiti, it doesn't make any sense to me, but...
Most frequently, the part that makes sense to those people is the name of the crew, the sponsor, if you will, of the individual doing it, and his tag name, the thing that he goes by, his trademark, his signature. Those are the things that they look for.
You stated that there's 3 or 4 factors regarding gang activity that you look at. Recently, we had an incident in Flower Bluff. And allegedly, this young man who was, I don't remember if he was half Asian and half Anglo, I wasn't certain, or half Asian and or half Hispanic or half Mexican American, who was being bullied. And allegedly, according to some newspaper accounts, it was actually reported once or twice, and allegedly there were witnesses. Can the children who, let's assume that that's all true, that this occurred, the young man committed suicide because he was being assaulted and or humiliated and or ridiculed, or a combination of all three. He committed suicide. Can the young people that did that, can they be prosecuted as a gang?
I don't know that is going to make our criteria under the penal code. Now, if the motivation for this particular group was not just intimidating young people, but say taking their lunch money, taking valuables, if it's stealing, yes, then they're definitely engaged in a criminal activity. And there's 3 or more people, and they're identified by this particular name or what they wear. That does seem to come within the definition of a gang.
Oh, I see.
I don't know if that's going to be viewed that way by the Corpus Christi Police Department gang unit without more information. But they would be the first determinant of whether they consider that activity to be gang.
So the Corpus Christi Police Department has a gang unit?
Yes, they do.
How many men or women are in the gang unit in the Corpus Christi Police Department?
It does vary, and I'm going by old numbers. This may not be current, but we are talking somewhere in the mid-20s, I believe. There have been some promotions. We have gang officers now serving as detectives side by side with the Criminal Investigation Division, or CID. However, their area of expertise is strictly the gang crimes that we see happening in the community. And just as before, what at one time was called the JET unit is now the gang unit. And we have officers in uniform whose primary duties are going to be to respond to calls that indicate gang activity or gang crimes. They also back up the regular officers on the street. They're kind of like the fire brigade if there's a significant call that requires more officers. And at any time, if they're the closest unit to a call, they're still going to respond. But those officers know what to look for. They know how to interview these people on the street. Frequently, the way they document a known gang member is that when they're not going to jail, when they're just talking with the guy in blue about what's going on in the neighborhood, they're willing to say, yeah, I'm down with so-and-so. Yeah, they got my back. And then the officer can document it in what we call a gang information sheet. And once it's documented, if it complies with the provisions of the Code of Federal Regulations, they're allowed to keep that list. At a certain point, individuals who haven't been contacted will roll off that list. But we also exclude times that they spend in jail or prison from the computation of the inactivity. And the officers know individuals on site frequently. If an individual trying to stay out of trouble says, no, I'm not in a gang, you're thinking of my brother, gives his brother's name and date of birth, a lot of times the officer's going to go, no, I contacted that guy 2 weeks ago, he's lying to you. And he'll tell the street officer, you also got a failure to identify as the fugitive here because that's his brother Jimmy. So it really helps to have these guys on the front lines.
I see. I'm changing subjects, and I don't think it's necessarily gang related, but you had mentioned to me when I spoke to you about coming on the show, you had been involved in the state school fight club incident. I don't think there was that. Why were you involved in that? Was that when you were involved with gang prosecution? Did they consider that a criminal gang of sorts?
No, at that point I had been promoted to supervisor. My responsibilities were, we have 2 felony supervisors and a first assistant working under Mr. Skirka.
So how do you supervise lawyers?
Basically,
You yell at them a lot? Say, look, what do you do?
I'm sure there were
What do
some
you do?
ex-employees that say I did have a
Rear
short
back their
temper.
fist?
But I tried to basically help them overcome the problems of learning how to do felony prosecution because I'd done it back in 1981 to 83.
What's the biggest problem in doing felony prosecution?
Of course, one of the factors is because, as even Mr. Skirka admitted, we don't pay people very well. This tends to be an entry-level position for people who want to do trial work. And they're going to get experience. They know they're not going to get paid very well. But the whole point is
How much
they
do they
don't
get
have...
paid?
I'm sorry?
How much do they get paid?
I can't actually tell you that.
Why? You don't know?
Not off the top of my head,
Okay.
no. In fact, the last time I would have known was back when I was a supervisor 3 years ago.
Oh, okay.
So it's not a secret that Nueces County has, of all the municipalities in Texas, I think the level of pay is about the 3rd lowest. Prosecutors in
Why
Laredo.
is that? We don't have any money? Is that because who's responsible for paying the assistant district attorneys in Nueces County and setting their pay raise? Do you know?
Ultimately, that's the regimen of the board of the commissioners court. Judge Lloyd Neal and the commissioners are responsible for that. Obviously, if Mr. Skirka asks, they're going to consider it if the tax level allows. I don't know. I haven't been in with him to a meeting of the commissioners court, so I don't know how that conversation goes. I know he has asked for both more positions and more
We're
money.
certainly taxed highly enough in this area.
Well, that's everyone's goal. Nobody wants to use the T word. But it's an epidemic part of our criminal justice system, too. The legislature had to decide how to make that budget. And in addition to cutting back schools, they essentially announced to all of us in the system, and judges too, we're not going to build any more new prisons. In fact, one near Sugar Land, Texas was shut down and not replaced. So if we're going to have less space for inmates, even though the population grows, we're going to be turning these people around a lot quicker in the Board of Pardons and Paroles. It's just a fact of life. We're not putting the resources into the system to make our streets safer. It's going to have the opposite effect.
Obviously, though, you and I might have a disagreement that I may not feel that building more prisons actually makes the streets safer. Especially, arguably, you know, how many clients, my clients always tell me this. They probably told you too. Well, can't I get house arrest? Right?
Unfortunately, the cost of the ankle monitor is extremely high, and the judges don't have that in their budget. If we can't have an offender whose family can pay for that device, unfortunately, the poor guy's going to get treated worse because he can't afford it.
Obviously, just an aside, it's not real important what I think, or it's not a learned opinion. It's just something that comes across. I always think, I said, gee, you know, you'd think with technology, they could keep a good, you know, it's pretty easy to keep tabs on people, whether it's a cell phone, whether or not it's GPS systems, et cetera. And I don't really appreciate necessarily building all these prisons, which, you know, could be from the conservative side of the argument too. I mean, you could argue that they're just more government jobs programs. Cops.
This is a dialogue we need to have. I'm
I
not
don't know.
saying I agree with your position.
I'm not saying that is my position. I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas. I would say that generally I probably have the opinion, again, for what my opinion's worth, and maybe, which is a little bit more of an insider opinion than the average person, that I'm not necessarily in agreement with building all these prisons and warehousing all these people for such a lengthy period of time, that it might cause additional social problems.
Well, now the one thing this is forcing us to do is we're looking at programs to get people out of our jail. I mean, we have this problem on a local level with jail overcrowding. One of our judges came up with a divert court, where we're talking about offenders like the young lady you mentioned, who's just got a problem with drugs and it's going to get her into a bad group. Why don't we take her out of the criminal justice system, get her the help she needs without an indictment hanging over her head? As long as she completes the programs, she doesn't have a conviction on her record.
What was the name of the judge who came up with the divert court?
Sandra Watts originally
And
sponsored that.
she did it a long time, and I must say that
She
was
did.
a rather heroic effort.
It was.
But you're not getting paid for that extra work
That's true. She did that largely out of her motivation.
for a long time.
And we've had other programs that have tried to do similar things. I believe there's
And,
still a Veterans Court.
I don't know how hard the judges are working, but everybody works pretty hard because the work is hard as a lawyer or a judge, right?
Sure.
So, those programs, I guess, are rather noble, but if they're not funded, it's very difficult to carry them through, right?
But it's making us think outside the box and try to come up with more alternatives. One of the other duties you asked me about, frequently, part of my job was to have a young prosecutor come in with a defense lawyer and have them present why a particular candidate should receive not probation, not even deferred probation, but a mechanism by which they spend a year on probation and have their case dismissed at the end of that year without even having the stigma of having been on a deferred adjudication probation.
Or it's also called pretrial
Pretrial
diversion.
diversion, correct. And because many times younger prosecutors don't understand how all these factors play in, the policy was to have a second person look at that.
Right.
But almost 90% of the time,
Right.
if a defense lawyer came in here with those reasons why this person was a candidate, I would sign the dismissal for the young attorney and say, here, get the paperwork done, get this one down the road.
I will say, and I've never heard this discussed, but you get a prosecutor, they don't have to be prosecuting very long. They pretty much learn the score pretty quick, most of them.
Sometimes through bad experiences.
Right. Well, I mean,
get
they
sniffered.
just pretty know. They know, as I say, they know somebody who's just kind of an irresponsible slacker versus somebody who's actually maybe evil versus somebody who just, they learn human nature, I think, pretty quick. Have you found that to be the case? People working with in the criminal justice system from the prosecution and defense. Would you say that's true?
Sure. The more you look at each file you look at, the more you look at it, gives you more information to make your next decision down the road.
And some of it is common sense, correct?
True.
We were talking. I interrupted you when you were talking about the state school fight club, and whether or not the people who worked at the state school, I guess many of them pled guilty or were found guilty. Is that correct?
Yes, and actually that was
my phone went off inadvertently, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
that was at a time when I was a supervisor and not the gang prosecutor.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost fortuitous that I was the lucky winner of that drawing because Mark Skirka, who was then the first assistant, called me on my day off on a Saturday and said, "Hey, I'm out of town with family, and they need someone to go over to the police department and find out about some dramatic occurrence that's just been exposed over at the state school. Can you go?" And I said, "Sure, I'll head over right now. I don't need to put on a suit, do I?" I arrived at CCPD, went up to the CID offices, and had state employees, law enforcement officers. Everybody's wearing a suit, and I'm wearing my blue jean sneakers and a Hawaiian shirt. But the main point was, we do work 24/7 if we have to. And because I was the first one on the scene, I was the logical one to try that case through all of the many defendants until it was completed.
Okay. Now, the defense in those cases could have been that these people in the Corpus Christi State School with learning impairments, learning disabled, etc., were fighting, and then I was photographing their fighting for legal purposes or to document it. Did anybody present that defense?
No, not at all. It was pretty obvious once the detectives got into the
I should have
investigation.
bet I know that. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, but there was certainly the arguments that you've been making, though, that these people were not hardened criminals. Most of them had little, if any, criminal background. I think we had one person who'd previously had a probation and probably wasn't going to be eligible anyway under those circumstances. But most of these people just made bad judgments in the course of, I guess, what was essentially a fairly boring job at work.
So they did encourage these people, whatever, mental retardation primarily, is that right? Physical problems?
All sorts of disabilities.
They did encourage them to fight.
Yes.
And they encouraged them to fight. Did they fight for a long time? Did they actually hurt each other? Did they not want to fight? What was the story?
Well, and one of these demonstrates their knowledge that what they were doing was wrong. There were physical injuries. There was one resident who had a cut over his eyebrow, and the staff fabricated a report for the incident that had occurred as saying that it had not happened during a fight, that it happened during I forget what the magic term they use, but of course if they have an inmate who gets excited, a resident who gets excited, they do have the right to calm them down, and they said that's what it was. It was a lawful restraint. We now know afterwards that it wasn't a lawful restraint. It was one inmate slugging another and hitting him right over the crease of the eye.
So under this big, thick law book, we've got all these crimes. So did you prosecute him also for filing false reports or something? Or what is that under? I can't, false report?
No, there probably was at least a misdemeanor level for that sort of conduct, but what we were focusing on was the fact that we had injury to a disabled person, which is generally a crime of the felony level, but it's upgraded one level where the person committing it has a duty to protect those individuals. And I think that's what made that such an appalling case to not only the state of Texas, but to our entire nation. I tell people that's the only case I can think of where I saw my opening statement on the crawler for CNN when I got home that night. But yes, the national media followed that case.
Well, let's talk about the national media for a second and the media generally. You know, whenever I have a client who told me this, where I find out his case has been on television, I go, oh boy.
One more problem, right?
Oh boy. Now, this is a big deal, right? And maybe, God forbid, I don't want to say anything bad about the judges, but they run for office. And arguably, one judge told me, Westergren, he's retired now, he told me, we're politicians, said that to me. I don't think that's it says, well, now we got to deal with this. If they continue to carry it. You don't know. They might just drop the case at the beginning. You'll never hear from it again.
Sure.
Or I don't know, they say this story has legs. I hear this is an insider term. They feel it has legs. And they make it a big deal, right?
Right.
So this case became a big deal. But thank God sounds like they were that severely hurt. Though, I mean, it's kind of egregious because these people were in situations of trying to help these people. Do you think it deserved that kind of publicity?
I don't know. I guess there's something about it that kind of struck a chord. That these are people we're entrusting to care for these individuals, not put them up to fight each other.
So in 3 years, if you're a judge and you get a high-profile case in your court and the media wants to bring in the cameras, are you going to allow the media to record the whole trial?
There are restrictions on media recording of trials. I have found
if you decide to put them.
That's right.
It
depends on the case. One solution that, and here again, I don't want to go outside of the race I'm involved in, but I have to commend Judge Sandra Watts for her notion that I will allow the media to come into the courtroom at a time when the jury is not present and take file footage.
Yeah, she does.
And then you're not prejudicing the individual defendant, his family, the witnesses, and the jurors that are actively engaged in the trial.
That's a good idea.
There are other instances where you may want to allow certain parts of the trial to be reported, but not if it's
We could do a phony opening statement for the cameras like we're acting. I'm just kidding.
Well,
we don't do that.
Done. Yeah.
Have you?
Some judges allow that, some judges don't.
Well, what's your opinion of the media, Ben, who's covered your cases? Have you had a good experience or bad experience?
I would say it's, for the most part, good.
Well,
The quality of